Thank you so much, and a big thanks to Arnab and Jeff for this invite. And I know it's early morning your side, but I think it's nothing better than on the breakfast table than talk strategy and relationships and smile about it. So I'm going to diverge a little from what I think was expected of me, and with all due apologies, because I just attended a 3-day UDA conference in San Francisco, and therefore there are some things that I'd like to share with this audience here. And so first, let's start off as the genesis of UDA. If you would remember, we just have barely managed to keep the maritime domain awareness concept or understand it and, assimilate it and work together. And of course, the Fusion Center at Changi Naval Base is one example. What we have in Gurugram is another. We have a few dots and dashes spread over the Indo-Pacific, and starting from Japan, Singapore, India have covered. You got the RCOC in Seychelles, and you have the Madagascar Fusion Center. And similarly, there are other smaller centers across the Indo-Pacific. But the question is, have we fully understood MDA, that we can learn something in the mannerisms or the methodology we have followed in cooperation? And do remember that MDA thrives on white shipping information. And even when IPMDA was first spoken of in Tokyo in 2020, there was mention of black shipping. And even on the sidelines last year of the UN General Assembly meetings, when the foreign ministers met, the same thing was reiterated, and the aspect of MDA, sort of addressing IU fishing also came up. So I'll put that on the back burner right now, maybe get back to it a little later. So when we look at underwater domain awareness, and Arnab has very nicely put out the challenges that the body of water under the surface presents us. First of all, you can't see there. So therefore, you are totally reliable, heavily reliant on technology, much more than the surface element. So if you are looking at UDA, and just as a side is that tomorrow would we be looking at air domain awareness as a separate entity, but that's just food for thought. So the question is that do we approach UDA as a subset of MDA, as one entity, or do we hyphenate the two, or do we look at it as a standalone area? And this approach is going to define the manner in which nations would actually decide to work together. And for the simple reason is, when we talk about UDA, the first thing anybody thinks about is submarines. Everything else comes later. So that is the one side of the cube which Arnab showed of strategic security. And if there is something that any nation who operates submarines loathes, is letting the world know where the submarines are, because it defeats the whole purpose of having submarines. So that will remain a major question when we start looking at, underwater domain awareness. So again, we will get back to the dialogue of, what sort of information are we going to share? And let's put intelligence off the table for now. It's not going to happen in a multilateral environment. It will best happen on a bilateral, but that is a separate topic altogether. So when you look at UDA, this is going to be technology heavy. The cost is going to be phenomenal. I've done a little bit of searching, and I just wanted to see what are the cost of laying the US sources line, what are the cost of maintaining it, what is the cost of the GI UK line, what is the cost of maintaining it, So therefore, you get back to the drawing board and say, what is the capacity and capability, and how many nations possess that capacity and capability? And I think I can mention 4 is US, France, Russia, and China. And why I say China, because China has an unmanned ocean network already in existence in the northern part of the South China Sea, around Hainan Island and the Paracels, it has already established, and therefore that is a stepping stone. And of course, they are doing underwater surveys in the IOR, which I will reflect upon in a little bit. So that cost involves not only developing and producing, but also you need specialist ships, you need specialist trained people, and you need to have a methodology of maintaining your underwater sensors, or even UUVs if you plan to do it. And do remember, especially the fixed sensors underwater, have a power pack. And if we are going to look at a mix of active and passive sensors, then the active sensors power packs will obviously run out fast. So these are issues. And along with that is the issue that what would be the ability of the nations who decide to walk this path to absorb that technology, to bear the cost? And if we take a leaf on from Trump 2.0, I mean, US is going to expect the nations who get involved, pay the ticket. Nothing's going to come for free. So there has to be more investments. Perhaps the synergy between India and US can permit a bilateral better understanding of establishing a UDA. But the question is where all? Would it be in the maritime zones of India or would it be in the high seas? Because any other nation may not like to have that sort of an understanding or that sort of a system up and running in its maritime zones for the reasons that I have mentioned earlier. So one is the cost, the ability, and then of course, I mean, Arnab had mentioned the HR issue, which would remain an important issue, is that how many people would you train? And therefore you would need to have that sort of an ecosystem set up and moving around. And then of course is that would you make your own doctrinal concepts or will you borrow them? And therefore this is a whole new area which needs to be looked at from the scratch. And we have just barely started down this road. And so let me look at that. Even if we set up, say, a UDA, and this is where the strategy comes in, is that are we required to set up separate centers in case we don't want to move this sort of information through the existing fusion centers? What sort of information would be there? And then you need to define the line that will divide, the strategic part or this military or the security part from the economy part. And economy part is your blue economy, is your following the fish, security of submarine cables, and there is a new term that is slowly emerging is the seabed lines of communication, your cables, your oil pipelines, your gas pipelines, and what have you out there. And therefore, the resources which are available, the resources which are available on the seabed where the high seas treaty is there, all right, is an issue that I think needs to be discussed, that how serious are we with the high seas treaty? It was opened for signature some time back. India generally was first off the block with all the bouquet of UNCLOS conventions and signed on the first day, but here we took a little over a year to sign it. And well, I'm really not sure what is the progress on the High Seas Treaty, whether it will become a reality or not. But I think this is a major aspect that when we discuss UDA, the High Seas Treaty willy-nilly has to get involved. And therefore, we need to have an understanding how are we going to approach the High Seas Treaty, which will define, again, the cooperation that will come about. Insofar as resources I've already covered in this, let's look at, how the Chinese methodology is working out. So I think a month or two back, Maldives signed an MOU with China permitting them to carry out underwater surveillance or surveys, perfectly in line with UNCLOS. UNCLOS provides for nations who don't have the capacity, capability to sign up with another nation, and there are a number of articles that quoted in UNCLOS. So this is a void that China has already moved ahead. So if we are behind them, it's going to take time for us to play catch. And by the time we decide to get our act together and we decide to work together, you'll find little less takers in the Indo-Pacific because they've already signed up with China. I was in Fiji a month back for the Fiji dialogue, and we had a Chinese research vessel berthed alongside. So the presence is already there, and the methodology that China uses is quite amazing. And just let me add on to what Professor Kugelman had said. They operate ships which are battery operated. Therefore, it means that they don't have to enter port for fueling. They are growing vegetables in glass containers, or they have their own methodology of growing vegetables while the ship sails. So the only need for the ship to enter harbor is the restriction of the human on board. And that is similar to what SSBNs and SSNs face. That the limitation is the crew. And at some point in time, they will have to hit land, and finally we look at terra firma. So, and they are laying these the survey chart or the whatever instruments you call it, and they do fixed zigzags. They're doing it on the high seas. So it's a methodology of already mapping the high seas, looking at where perhaps where fish is going, perhaps where the resources are available. And of course, China has signed the High Seas Treaty. So it's already ahead of us insofar, I would say, as the blue economy is concerned, the blue economy angle. So these are aspects that need to be looked at. A little bit on the US-India part of this. And Of course, if we read the statement that came out after the Prime Minister and the President met, we've got a little more jargon coming out. So one is trust, transforming the relationship utilizing strategic technology, and then you have Asia, Autonomous Systems Industry Alliance. The question is that this is all right. But if you go back to ISET and you go back to sharing of technology, I don't think the US will be willing to share all the technology. It's not shared technology with its allies. So to expect the US to share that technology with us, 100%, would be perhaps a wrong path to choose. So we would be playing the junior partner. Would we allow them? Would we allow setting up of sensors in our maritime zone? This is something for the establishment to take up, keeping security in view. And that area obviously is going to be perhaps in most probably the Arabian Sea and in the Bay of Bengal and other places, which could make our neighbors uncomfortable. So we already have a little setback on the neighborhood first policy. So these are issues that we need to look at as far as geopolitics is concerned. These issues which I have covered would resonate in other maritime areas, even if we go ahead. But there is a method of, and that is, I'm a big fan of trilat. So let me end my swing by, we need to look at this at a trilateral basis, look at specific issues and try to progress this further. We can either push it through the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative that looks at many issues that cover all this, or we could look at it through trilateral. There are already many existing. We just need to kickstart them again and get them working on areas of convergence, especially where UD is concerned. But note a point of caution is that insofar as security issues are concerned, nations may not be willing, and that's my reading, that they will not be willing to open their doors fully to the UDA. So we have a lot of work to do. And then, of course, there is a need to come on the table and talk to each other. Thank you.